Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Story Time with Aunt Becky. How are you doing? Here it is. It was raining the other day, and now it's really cold. A while back, I mentioned James Herriot books, and this is one called The Christmas Day Kitten. I've had to use some tape and tape it up a bit because it's getting old. I've had it since I was young, and a woman that we used to call Aunt Diane gave it to me, so um, I thought I might read it to you later on. We'll read to you some of the other ones that I have, but this is one of the Christmas ones, the Christmas Day Kitten. And I like cats, so it's easier to read books when you take off the paper sleeve. So I'm going to read it like this, and I hope you enjoy this. James Herriot has lots of good stories, and if you ever get a chance to read some of his stories. So here is the Christmas Day Kitten. There's a pretty kitty. If you like cats, this is for you. And this guy's a vet, just so you know. So he always writes about animals and his experiences with animals. Christmas can never go by without my remembering a certain little cat. I first saw her when I came to see one of Mrs. Pickering's much-loved basset hounds. He's driving along. This is in the old days. There's Mrs. Pickering in her house. He lives in England, I think around Scotland, Ireland, works around somewhere around there. I looked in some surprise at the furry creature moving quietly down the hall. "I didn't know you had a cat," I said to Mrs. Pickering, who was a plumpish, pleasant-faced woman. Mrs. Pickering smiled. "We haven't, really. Debbie is a stray. She comes here 2 or 3 times a week, and we give her some food. I don't know where she lives." "Do you ever get the feeling that she wants to stay with you?" I asked. "No," Mrs. Pickering shook her head. "She's a timid little thing. Just creeps in, has some food, then slips away. She doesn't seem to want to let me help her in any way." I looked at the little tabby again. "But she isn't just having food today." "It's a funny thing, but every now and again she pops through into the sitting room and sits by the fire for a few minutes. It's as though she was giving herself a treat." This is Miss Pickering, and there's the kitty. The little cat was sitting very upright on the thick rug which lay in front of the fireplace, in which the coals glowed and flamed. The 3 bassets were already lying there, but they seemed used to Debbie because 2 of them sniffed her in a bored manner, and the 3rd merely cocked a sleepy eye at her before flopping back to sleep. Debbie made no effort to curl up or wash herself or do anything other than gaze quietly ahead. This was obviously a special event in her life, a treat. There she is sitting up, and there's the fire. Something like a roaring fire. On YouTube now you can find fireplaces, all kinds of fireplaces. My husband and I just like to hear the crackling noises without any music, and it's very nice. Then suddenly she turned and crept from the room without a sound and was gone. "That's just the way it is with Debbie," said Mrs. Pickering, laughing. "She never stays more than 10 minutes or so, then she's off." I often visited the Pickering home, and I always looked out for the little cat. On one occasion, I spotted her nibbling daintily from a saucer at the kitchen door. As I watched, she turned and almost floated on light footsteps into the hall, then through into the sitting room. And there she is. Debbie settled herself in the middle of the pile of basset hounds in her usual way, upright, still, and gazing into the glowing fire. This time I tried to make friends with her, but she leaned away as I stretched out my hand. However, I talked to her softly, and I managed to stroke her cheek with one finger. Sometimes you get some cats that try to be nice and sweet to them, and they just won't have it. Then it was time for her to go, and once outside the house, she jumped up on the stone wall and down the other side. The last I saw was the little tabby figure flitting away across the grassy field. I wonder where she goes, I murmured. That's something we've never been able to find out, said Mrs. Pickering. Here's a stone wall, and there's the cat going away in the grass. It was 3 months later that I next heard from Mrs. Pickering, and it happened to be Christmas morning. I'm so sorry to bother you today of all days, said Mrs. Pickering apologetically. Don't worry at all, I said. Which of the dogs needs attention? It's not the dogs, it's Debbie. She's come to the house and there's something very wrong. Please come quickly. She's all concerned and upset. I drove through the empty market square. The snow was thick on the road and on the roofs of the surrounding houses. The shops were closed, but the pretty colored lights of the Christmas trees winked in the windows. Here's their roads, and here's some Christmas lights in the windows there. If you go there during Christmas, you'll get snow. Mrs. Pickering's house was beautifully decorated with tinsel and holly, and the rich smell of turkey and sage and onion stuffing wafted from the kitchen. But she had a very worried look on her face as she led me through to the sitting room. Debbie was there, but she wasn't sitting upright in her usual position. She was lying quite still, and huddled close to her lay a tiny kitten. I looked down in amazement. What have we got here? It's the strangest thing, Mrs. Pickering replied. I haven't seen her for several weeks, and then she came in about 2 hours ago, staggered into the kitchen, and she was carrying the kitten in her mouth. She brought it in here and laid it on the rug. Almost immediately I could see that she wasn't well. Then she lay down like this, and she hasn't moved since. Here's the kitty, and there's the baby kitten all curled up next to her. I knelt on the rug and passed my hand over Debbie's body, which Mrs. Pickering had placed on a piece of sheet. She was very, very thin, and her coat was dirty. I knew that she didn't have long to live. Is she ill, Mr. Herriot? Asked Mrs. Pickering in a trembling voice. Yes, I'm afraid so, but I don't think she is in any pain. Mrs. Pickering looked at me, and I saw there were tears in her eyes. Then she knelt beside Debbie and stroked the cat's head while the tears fell on the dirty fur. Oh, the poor little thing! I should have done more for her. I spoke gently. Nobody could have done more than you. Nobody could have been kinder. And see, she has brought her kitten to you, hasn't she? Yes, you are right, she has. Mrs. Pickering reached out and lifted up the tiny bedraggled kitten. Isn't it strange? Debbie knew she was dying, so she brought her kitten here, and on Christmas Day. I bent down and put my hand on Debbie's heart. There was no beat. I'm afraid she has died. I lifted the feather-light body, wrapped it in a piece of sheet, and took it out to the car. There's the 3 baskets, the Christmas tree in the middle, and there's Mrs. Pickering and Debbie and the little kitten by the fire. When I came back, Mrs. Pickering was still stroking the kitten. The tears had dried, and she was bright-eyed as she looked at me. I've never had a cat before, she said. I smiled. Well, it looks as though you've got one now. She's very happy, and she's cuddling that little baby kitten. Look at him. He's so cute. And she certainly had. The kitten grew rapidly into a sleek, handsome, and bouncy tabby cat, and Mrs. Pickering called him Buster. He wasn't timid like his little mother, and he lived like a king. And with the ornate collar he always wore, looked like one, too. There he is. There's his ornate collar. And he's stalking a snail. It's just outside the door. I watched him grow up with delight, but the occasion that always stays in my mind was the following Christmas Day, a year after his arrival. I was on my way home after visiting a farmer with a sick cow, and I was looking forward to my Christmas dinner. Excuse me. Mrs. Pickering was at her front door when I passed her house, and I heard her call out, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Herriot. Come in and have a drink to warm you up." I had a little time to spare, so I stopped the car and went in. In the house there was all the festive cheer of last year and the same glorious whiff of sage and onion stuffing. But this year there was no sorrow. There was Buster. There she is calling him at the door, and there is Buster. Doesn't he look handsome? He was darting up to each of the basset hounds in turn, ears pricked, eyes twinkling, dabbing a paw at them, and then streaking away. Mrs. Pickering laughed. "Buster does tease them so. He gives them no peace." She was right. For a long time the dogs had led a rather sedate life, gentle walks with their mistress, plenty of good food, and long snoring sessions on the rugs and armchairs. Then Buster arrived. He was now dancing up to the youngest dog again, head on one side, asking him to play. When he started boxing with both paws, it was too much for the basset, who rolled over with the cat in a wrestling game. "Come into the garden," said Mrs. Pickering. "I want to show you something." She lifted a hard rubber ball from the sideboard, and we went outside. There he is. There's two of the dogs. He's teasing that one. Boxing with his paws, as it said. She threw the ball across the lawn, and Buster bounded after it over the frosty grass, his tabby coat gleaming in the sun. He seized the ball in his mouth, brought it back to his mistress, dropped it at her feet, and waited. Mrs. Pickering threw it again, and again Buster brought it back. There he is. He's chasing the ball. There's the three dogs in the doorway, and Mr. Herriot and Mrs. Pickering. I've never seen a cat play fetch before. I gasped. A retriever cat. The Bassets looked on unimpressed. Nothing would ever make them chase a ball, but Buster did it again and again as though he would never tire of it. Mrs. Pickering turned to me. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" "No," I replied. "He is a most remarkable cat." Here's a big picture. There's those Bassets again. See, he's dropped his ball at his mistress's feet. There's his ornate collar. He's a retriever cat. We went back into the house, where she held Buster close to her, laughing as the big cat purred loudly. Looking at him, so healthy and contented, I remembered his mother, who had carried her tiny kitten to the only place of comfort and warmth she had ever known. Mrs. Pickering was thinking the same thing, because she turned to me, and although she was smiling, her eyes were thoughtful. "Debbie would be pleased," she said. I nodded. "Yes, she would. It was just a year ago today she brought him in, wasn't it?" "That's right." She hugged Buster again. "The best Christmas present I've ever had." There you can see his collar real well. She's hugging him. You think those dogs are jealous? Aw, and there's where cats like to be, in a warm window, snug. I've always liked that story for a long time, and I like to bring it out and read it again every year. So I hope you have enjoyed it as well. And after Christmas, I have 3 or 4 more books by James Herriot that I can share that are very similar to this one. And I thank Aunt Diane, who first gave this to me. She was somebody else's aunt at our church, but we always called her aunt because we were close with the family, real good friends. And when she came, be it January or March for their Christmas, she always brought us some Christmas, and she gave me these books, and I treasure them. I wish I could get a chance to tell her how much that they meant to me, because one of the best things to give somebody that loves to read is another book. So I still treasure them all, and I love to read them. I hope you have enjoyed that. I will let you go until next time when we have another Christmas story. It is this time next week will be Christmas Day, and I won't be doing anything then, but I hope you will all be enjoying your holidays as well as I will be mine. Thank you for joining me again, and we'll see you next time. Bye.